Put your hands behind your back.
More focused on discovering who reported her than acknowledging her wrongdoing, Samantha continues to argue with the police about the incident, despite her daughter becoming emotional.
I need another cup.
The first moments of this footage establish a truth that law enforcement encounters far too often. Danger does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through absence, negligence, and a failure of responsibility. The Bodycam activates on what appears to be a routine welfare check. Yet beneath the surface lies a pattern of decisions that place children directly in harm's path. In the opening case, officers respond to a report that should never exist: a toddler wandering unclothed along a busy roadway. This is not a high-crime stop. There is no suspect description, no weapons call, no active threat. And yet, the risk level is immediate and severe. A child this young lacks any concept of traffic, speed, or consequence. The danger is absolute. The officer's approach is controlled and deliberate. He does not rush to judgment. He does not escalate. Instead, he stabilizes the most vulnerable variable in the scene: the child. This is a critical law enforcement principle often misunderstood by the public. In child endangerment situations, the priority is not punishment. It is preservation. Only once safety is secured can accountability be addressed. As the officer attempts to locate the parents, a troubling pattern begins to emerge. This is not unfamiliar territory: prior contact, prior warnings, prior failures. That history matters, not emotionally but legally. In cases involving neglect, repetition transforms negligence into recklessness. It shifts the threshold from poor judgment to criminal disregard. When the parents finally appear, their demeanor becomes the silent evidence. There is no urgency, no panic, no recognition of danger narrowly avoided. Instead, explanations minimize the risk. They were sleeping. They didn't notice. These are not defenses. They are admissions. This is where authority begins to shift, not through force, but through documentation. The officer recognizes that a warning would not correct the behavior because it already failed to do so before. Law enforcement is not obligated to wait for tragedy to justify action. Preventive intervention is not overreach when the risk is documented and repeated. The arrests that follow are not emotional reactions. They are procedural conclusions. Child neglect is not defined by intent. It is defined by outcome and risk exposure. A toddler alone in traffic satisfies both. The second incident escalates in a different way. Here, law enforcement responds to suspected financial fraud, but the real story unfolds through behavior. When officers enter, the suspects immediately attempt to flee. That decision alone changes the legal landscape. Flight establishes consciousness of guilt. It authorizes detention. It justifies force. What follows is a textbook example of how denial collapses under objective recording. The suspects verbally deny fleeing, while the Bodycam captures movement, resistance, and evasion. This contradiction is crucial. Bodycam footage removes narrative control from the subject and transfers it to evidence. As officers search belongings to establish identity, the situation deepens. Fraud indicators become drug possession. Outstanding warrants surface. Each discovery compounds the case, not because officers went looking for more charges, but because deception necessitated verification. And there is a common misconception that law enforcement adds charges. In reality, behavior reveals exposure. Cooperation narrows outcomes, resistance widens them. The third scenario returns the focus to children and to a failure that cannot be explained away. Two young children are left alone in an apartment for extended periods. One is an infant. The other is barely old enough to comprehend responsibility, yet she is expected to shoulder it. Officers approach with restraint. Their language is calm, their posture is non-threatening. They are not there to arrest yet. They are there to assess welfare. The children's responses reveal a normalized pattern of abandonment. This is not an isolated errand. This is routine. When the mother returns, the dynamic shifts sharply. Instead of concern, she displays hostility. Instead of explanation, she challenges authority. This is a critical psychological pivot. Accountability is replaced with deflection. Responsibility becomes entitlement. At this stage, officers are legally obligated to continue. Once child welfare is questioned, disengagement is not an option. This is not harassment. It is statutory duty. The mother's refusal to cooperate transforms a welfare inquiry into a criminal investigation. Her escalating aggression, verbal and physical, forces officers into a narrow corridor of options. Compliance would have preserved control. Resistance removes it. The arrest does not occur because of disagreement. It occurs because of obstruction, assault, and refusal to comply with lawful commands. The presence of children complicates everything, yet it does not negate enforcement. In fact, it heightens the necessity for order. The final case in this segment delivers perhaps the most unsettling image. A 7-year-old child walking alone into a bar at 2 a.m, searching for her mother. This is not neglect hidden behind closed doors. This is neglect exposed to strangers. Bar staff do what responsible adults should. They intervene, protect, and call authorities. Law enforcement enters not as enforcers but as guardians. The child's composure is heartbreaking. She explains events with clarity no child should possess. Hours pass before the mother returns. Her explanation fractures under scrutiny. Memory gaps, contradictions, alcohol consumption. None of these erase the fact that a child was left alone for hours in the middle of the night. This is where law enforcement must confront an uncomfortable reality. Intent does not outweigh impact. Whether through intoxication, poor judgment, or denial, the outcome is the same: a child placed at risk. By the end of Part 1, a clear pattern emerges across all cases. Authority is not abused here, it is tested. And when tested against vulnerability, evidence, and law, it responds not with spectacle, but with consequence. These are not stories of police aggression. They are stories of boundaries crossed repeatedly until intervention becomes unavoidable. And the most critical truth remains. In every case, escalation was not initiated by officers. It was invited by negligence, defiance, and refusal to accept responsibility. Opening hook clip, 15 to 20 seconds. Use this as intro timestamp 1723, 1742. This is the exact authority shift moment where the mother refuses cooperation, escalates verbally, and the officer's tone hardens. The point of no return. The body-worn camera begins not with chaos, but with quiet responsibility. Two officers step into a space that should never be silent. A home where children are present, but parents are not. The absence is not dramatic at first. No alarms, no screams. Just a 7-year-old girl standing inside a small apartment, carrying the weight of adulthood far too early, and a 9-month-old baby who cannot speak for himself. This is how neglect often appears on camera. not as violence, but as abandonment wrapped in excuses. From the first moments, the officer's approach is measured. Their posture is non-threatening and their voices remain calm. This is not enforcement yet. It is assessment. They do not accuse. They do not raise volume. They gather facts. How long has the mother been gone? Has this happened before? Is anyone hurt? These questions are not procedural formalities. They are legal thresholds. In child welfare cases, officers must establish risk, not just absence. A child alone is concerning. A child alone repeatedly becomes a pattern. A child alone with an infant escalates the situation entirely. As the camera records, the 7-year-old explains with unsettling normalcy that this is not unusual. She knows how long her mother is usually gone. She knows how to care for her baby brother. She knows how to wait. This is the first power shift, not between police and parent, but between childhood and forced responsibility. The officer does not react emotionally. He listens. He understands that what the child describes meets the definition of endangerment, even before the parent returns. Importantly, the officers do not remove the children immediately. This restraint matters. Contrary to public misconception, police cannot simply take kids without cause. They must document conditions, assess danger, and attempt parental contact. And they do. When the mother arrives, the tone of the encounter changes. Not because the officers escalate, but because she does. She enters not with concern, not with urgency, not with relief. She enters with confrontation. Her first priority is not her children's safety, but identifying who reported her. This is a critical psychological marker. In accountability cases, defensiveness often replaces responsibility when authority is challenged. The officers attempt to redirect. They explain why they are present. They request a conversation outside. They attempt to lower emotional temperature. Each effort is met with resistance. Here, the misuse of authority begins, not by police, but by the parent. She repeatedly asserts ownership over the space as a shield against accountability. Get out of my house. Mind your business. These statements misunderstand the legal reality. Once child welfare is implicated, the threshold is no longer private property. It is public duty. The officers state clearly that this is a child abuse investigation. That word matters. It is not rhetorical. It signals that reasonable suspicion has already been established based on documented facts and prior calls. The mother rejects the premise outright, insisting nothing criminal has occurred. This is where escalation psychology becomes visible. Instead of cooperating to de-escalate, she challenges authority directly while emotionally destabilizing her child. The camera captures the daughter crying, a secondary victim of the confrontation unfolding in front of her. At this point, the officers face a narrowing set of lawful options. Continued non-cooperation in a welfare investigation is not neutral. It compounds risk. The officers issue clear instructions. Lower your voice. Step outside. Talk calmly. Each instruction is an opportunity to reset the encounter. Each one is refused. When the mother physically resists movement and continues aggressive verbal behavior, the legal threshold shifts again, from investigation to enforcement. This is not about punishment. It is about control of a volatile situation involving minors. The arrest decision is not sudden. It is cumulative. Bodycam critics often isolate the moment of physical force without acknowledging the chain of refusals preceding it. Here, the camera does not cut. The audience sees every attempt at verbal resolution. The escalation is documented step by step. When officers attempt to place her in custody, resistance escalates into physical struggle. She pulls away, she stiffens, she refuses commands. Each action legally authorizes increased force under standard use of force continuums, not as retaliation, but as compliance tools. The moment she is taken to the ground is not the beginning of force. It is the end of negotiation. Crucially, throughout the restraint, officers continue verbal commands focused on safety. Stop resisting, breathe, cooperate. The objective is not dominance, it is control. And the presence of children intensifies the necessity to end the struggle quickly. What makes this case particularly instructive is not just the arrest, but what it reveals about systemic failure, multiple prior calls, repeated abandonment, a child who knows the routine. This is not an isolated mistake. It is a pattern that went uncorrected until crisis forced intervention. This is where institutional accountability intersects with individual behavior. Police are often the final safeguard, not the first. By the time they arrive, neglect has already occurred. As the mother continues verbal abuse even after restraint, the contrast becomes stark. Authority is no longer being challenged. It is being denied entirely. She does not acknowledge risk. She does not acknowledge harm. She does not acknowledge responsibility. And that denial is precisely why intervention becomes unavoidable. By the end of part 1, the foundation is clear. This is not a story about officers overreacting. It is a case study in how small decisions, leaving briefly, doing it before, dismissing risk, accumulate into irreversible consequences. The camera does not editorialize, it records. And what it records is a system stepping in where parenting failed, not to punish, but to protect. Part 3, Documentary Commentary. By the time the final set of officers step back and reassess the scene, the pattern is no longer isolated. What began as individual incidents, each framed by neglect, denial, or confrontation, has now revealed itself as something broader and more systemic. These are not rare lapses or momentary failures, and they are repetitions of the same behavior under different circumstances, driven by the same refusal to accept responsibility when authority intervenes on behalf of a child. In the last case, the timeline itself becomes the most damning evidence. Hours pass, not minutes, not a misunderstanding of time. A 7-year-old child navigates darkness, uncertainty, and fear alone, while adults around her scramble to compensate for a void that should never have existed. The officer's calm persistence contrasts sharply with the chaos created by the parent's absence. Each step they take, documenting, waiting, verifying, is methodical, because the stakes are no longer hypothetical. A child has already been left to fend for herself. What's striking is not just the neglect, but the normalization of it by the parent. Throughout the interaction, explanations shift, details soften, responsibility diffuses outward, circumstances are blamed, memory gaps are invoked. But the officers are not evaluating excuses, they are reconstructing reality. And reality, piece by piece, refuses to align with the narrative being offered. This is where Bodycam footage becomes uniquely powerful. It doesn't argue, it doesn't editorialize, it simply records. And over time, the footage exposes the gaps between what is said and what actually happened. The longer the interaction continues, the more those gaps widen. Calm questions meet inconsistent answers. Gentle clarification meets deflection. Eventually, the contradictions stack too high to ignore. At this stage, the officer's role shifts. They are no longer responding to a welfare check. They are managing the consequences of prolonged neglect. The tone changes subtly, not through raised voices or threats, but through firmness. The language becomes procedural, options narrow, accountability enters the frame. This transition is critical. It demonstrates how law enforcement intervention is often reactive rather than preventative. Officers are not present to stop the initial act of neglect. They arrive after the risk has already materialized. Their task is not to undo harm, but to prevent further harm, and to document enough evidence to ensure the system responds appropriately. Across all the cases presented, a shared psychological thread emerges: entitlement, not the loud, performative kind, but a quieter belief that personal judgment supersedes legal obligation, that a parent's intent matters more than outcome, that familiarity with risk somehow neutralizes it, that authority, when questioned, is an intrusion rather than a safeguard. This mindset becomes especially visible when parents push back against intervention. Resistance is rarely about misunderstanding the law, it's about rejecting oversight. The moment officers assert responsibility for child welfare, some parents interpret it as a personal attack rather than a protective measure. And in doing so, they escalate situations that could have ended very differently. The footage shows how quickly escalation compounds. A refusal to cooperate becomes verbal hostility. Verbal hostility becomes physical resistance. Physical resistance introduces new charges, new consequences, and deeper system involvement. None of it begins with intent to harm, but intent becomes irrelevant when risk is real and ongoing. For the children involved, these moments are formative. They watch adults argue with authority over their safety. They witness tension where reassurance should exist. Even when officers remain composed, the environment itself becomes destabilizing. This is why child welfare cases are among the most difficult to navigate, because every decision carries emotional weight far beyond the legal framework. The officer's restraint in these moments deserves scrutiny, not praise, but understanding. They balance enforcement with empathy, authority with patience. They repeat explanations, they lower their voices, they attempt de-escalation even when met with hostility. These are not dramatic gestures. They are quiet efforts to keep situations from spiraling further. Still, restraint has limits. When cooperation collapses entirely, officers must act, not to punish, but to protect. Arrests in these cases are not symbolic. They are procedural necessities. Once resistance escalates, the legal threshold is crossed, and the system responds accordingly. What follows is often misunderstood by the public. Arrest does not automatically equate to loss of parental rights. Child Protective Services involvement is not a sentence. It is an assessment. But the presence of the system itself is disruptive, and that disruption is felt most acutely by the children. The final scenes underscore a difficult truth. Accountability often arrives too late. These children were not rescued from a single mistake. They were removed from patterns of neglect, denial, and deflection that had already repeated before officers ever arrived. Bodycam footage doesn't sensationalize this reality, it exposes it. It shows how quickly everyday negligence can escalate into legal consequence. It shows how authority, when challenged repeatedly, must eventually assert itself, and it shows how systems designed to protect children operate under immense pressure, with imperfect information, in real time. As the cases conclude, the officers return to their vehicles. Reports must be written, calls continue. The children are placed in temporary care, and the parents are left to confront a reality they can no longer talk their way out of. The camera keeps recording until the moment ends, not with resolution but with consequence. This is where the story truly settles, not in outrage, not in judgment, but in inevitability. When responsibility is ignored long enough, intervention becomes unavoidable. And when authority is tested at the expense of safety, the system responds, not emotionally but procedurally. These incidents are not warnings. They are records. And the record is clear. Child welfare is not negotiable. Neglect does not require intent. Accountability does not wait for regret. And authority, when exercised properly, exists not to dominate, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves.